They mocked her tiny inheritance, a forgotten plot of land with a crumbling house and a debt she could never pay. But what she found hidden in the floor of the old stable wouldn't just change her life, it would rewrite her entire past. And if you've ever been handed something that felt more like a burden than a gift, I want you to stick around. Hit that subscribe button, because this story is for anyone who's ever had to find value where no one else thought to look. The day I turned 18 was the day I legally ceased to exist, at least as far as the state was concerned. For 12 years, I had been a file in a cabinet, a line item in a budget, a name on a rotating chore chart. Alara Vance, ward of the state. Now, I was just Alara. The silence that followed my name felt vast and terrifying. There was no party, there was no cake, except for the dry sheet cake served once a month for everyone whose birthday fell within that 30-day window. Mine was lumped in with a 7-year-old who cried because he wanted blue frosting, not white, and a 15-year-old who was just marking another year until his own emancipation. I got a corner piece, the frosting thick and cloyingly sweet. It tasted like freedom, which I was quickly learning tasted a lot like sugar and disappointment. My worldly possessions fit into 2 black trash bags, clothes that had been donated, worn by 3 girls before me, and would be left behind for the next girl after. A handful of paperback books with cracked spines. A small, smooth gray stone I'd kept in my pocket since I was 6, the last day I saw my grandmother. That was it. That was the sum of my life. Mrs. Gable, the house manager at Northwood Group Home for Girls, called me into her office an hour before I had to be out. Her office smelled like stale coffee and lemon-scented cleaner, a combination that had served as the official scent of authority for my entire adolescence. She didn't smile. She rarely did. It wasn't a place for coddling. It was a place for processing. And I was being processed out. "Alara," she said, tapping a thin manila folder on her desk. My file. My life, condensed to a stack of papers held together by a metal clasp. "You're 18. As of 9:04 this morning. Congratulations." The word hung in the air, hollow and out of place. She slid a long white envelope across the desk. It was heavy, made of thick, expensive-feeling paper that seemed alien in this world of flimsy triplicate forms. My name and the home's address were typed on the front. "This arrived for you, from a law firm. It's been held for you, instructed to be given on your 18th birthday." I picked it up. The weight was surprising. For a moment, a wild, childish hope flared in my chest. A secret relative, a long-lost family coming to claim me. A mistake had been made. But I'd learned a long time ago that hope was a dangerous thing. It made you soft. It made the inevitable fall that much harder. "A law firm?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Mrs. Gable shrugged, a small, tired movement of her shoulders. "Says so on the return address. Look, Alara, your bus ticket to the city shelter is here." She pushed another, much flimsier envelope toward me. "Check-in is before 9 p.m. Don't be late. They're strict." She stood up, a clear signal that our time was over. My 12 years in her system were concluded with 2 envelopes and a bus schedule. It was efficient, if nothing else. I clutched the heavy envelope in my hand, the crisp edges digging into my palm. It felt like the only real thing in the room. I walked out of her office, past the living room where the younger girls were watching cartoons, their faces slack and hypnotized by the flickering screen. No one looked up. No one said goodbye. It was better that way. Departures were a constant, like laundry day or the weekly fire drill. You just got used to them. I sat on the bus, the city skyline a smudge of gray in the distance, and finally opened the thick envelope. Inside was a letter from a firm called Davies and Dunn, Attorneys at Law. The language was dense, full of words like testament, bequeathed, and executor. It took me 3 reads to understand the gist of it. My grandmother, Maeve O'Connell, had passed away 2 years ago. I hadn't known. No one had told me. A cold, hard knot formed in my stomach. The last piece of my past, the only person who had ever felt like family, was gone, and I was only just now finding out. The letter went on. In her will, she had left me her sole possession, a property. It listed an address in a town I'd never heard of, Sparrow Creek. It was described as 1/2 acre of land containing 1 residential structure and 1 ancillary outbuilding. A house and a barn, I translated. Or a shed. A tiny flare of that dangerous hope sparked again. A house. A home. Then I got to the second page. It was a statement from the county tax office. The property had 2 years of unpaid taxes, plus penalties and interest. The total was a number that might as well have been $1 million. $4,821.17. A notice was attached. The property was scheduled for a tax auction in 90 days if the debt was not settled. The letter from the lawyer, a Mr. Davies, concluded with a polite but firm paragraph. His firm had been contracted by my grandmother to execute the will and nothing more. Their professional obligations were now complete. They wished me the best in my future endeavors. The knot in my stomach tightened. So this was my inheritance. Not a home, but a debt. A ticking clock. It was a cruel joke. A burden dressed up as a gift. I leaned my head against the vibrating window of the bus, the city lights beginning to blur through the tears I refused to let fall. Mrs. Gable would have called it a life lesson. I called it a punchline. I arrived at the shelter that night, the letter folded in my pocket, feeling heavier than the smooth gray stone that was my only other link to a past I barely remembered. The intake worker, a man with a kind but exhausted face, saw the legal envelope when I was pulling out my ID. "What's that? You get yourself in some trouble already?" he asked, a hint of dry humor in his voice. I shook my head. "An inheritance," I said, the word tasting like ash. He raised an eyebrow. I explained. "A 1/2 acre of land, a house, $4,800 in back taxes." He let out a low whistle, a mix of pity and dark amusement. "Some inheritance," he said, shaking his head. "They give you a mountain of debt and call it a gift. Happens all the time. Developers let the taxes pile up on worthless land until the county takes it. Then they swoop in and buy it for pennies. You got a name for that developer?" I shook my head. "Doesn't matter. Don't you worry about it. You're better off here. At least the roof doesn't leak. Probably." He stamped my form and handed me a thin blanket and a pillowcase. "Welcome to the real world, kid." His words echoed what I already felt. The inheritance wasn't a lifeline. It was an anchor. For a week, I lived in the rhythm of the shelter. Wake up at 6. Line up for breakfast. Pound the pavement looking for a job that didn't exist for an 18-year-old with no address, no references, and no experience. Line up for dinner. Lights out at 10. The letter stayed in my pocket, a constant, nagging weight. I read it over and over, trying to decipher a hidden meaning that wasn't there. My grandmother, Maeve. I could barely picture her face. I remembered her hands, though. Strong, a little rough, always smelling faintly of soil and lavender. I remembered her voice, a low hum that felt like safety. She'd given me the stone. "For grounding," she'd said, closing my small hand around it. "When you feel like you're floating away, you hold this, and it'll remind you where the ground is." Why would she leave me a debt? Why would she leave me a problem I couldn't possibly solve? It didn't make sense. It didn't square with the memory of her hands, of her voice. One night, unable to sleep on the lumpy cot, the sounds of coughing and quiet sobbing filling the cavernous room, I pulled out the letter again. This time I noticed something I'd missed, a small, handwritten note at the very bottom of the lawyer's typed page, almost an afterthought. It was in a different pen, a hurried scrawl. It said, "Your grandmother also left a small personal effects box. It's at our office. You can retrieve it during business hours." A box. A small box of personal effects. It was nothing. A few trinkets, probably. Photos. Junk. But it was something. It was a thread. The next day, I skipped the fruitless job search. I used the last of the cash I'd been given upon my release, a starter fund of $50, to take a bus to the address of the law firm. It was in a part of the city where the buildings were tall and made of glass, reflecting a sky that seemed bluer and cleaner than the one above the shelter. The lobby was all marble and quiet efficiency. I felt like a ghost, a smudge of grime in their pristine world. A receptionist with a perfectly symmetrical face looked at me with an expression of polite confusion. I gave her my name and mentioned the letter. She spoke into her headset, her voice a hushed murmur. A few minutes later, a man in a crisp suit emerged. He looked to be in his late 50s, with silver hair and a weary but not unkind expression. "Mr. Davies?" I asked. He nodded. "Miss Vance, please, come in." His office was even quieter than the lobby. It was lined with books that looked like they'd never been read. He didn't ask me to sit. He just went to a closet and pulled out a small, plain cardboard box, about the size of a shoebox, sealed with yellowing tape. "Here you are," he said, placing it on the polished surface of his desk. "As I stated in my letter, our professional obligations are fulfilled. But I will give you a piece of off-the-record advice." He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "The property is not worth the debt. Sparrow Creek is a dying town. A development group, Blackwood, has been buying up defaulted properties out there for years. They're just waiting for the clock to run out on yours. They'll get it at auction. My advice? Forget about it. It's a ghost. Let it go." He sounded sincere. He sounded like he was trying to help me, but his advice felt like a dismissal. Let it go. The same thing everyone had told me about my past, about my family. Just let it go and move on. "Thank you," I said, my voice flat. I picked up the box. It was surprisingly light. "Is that all?" Mr. Davies nodded. "That's all." I took the box back to the shelter, but I didn't open it there. It felt too private. I found a small park, a patch of green wedged between two concrete buildings, and sat on a bench. With trembling fingers, I broke the old tape and lifted the lid. The box smelled like dust and time. Inside, there wasn't much. A handful of faded photographs. One was of a young woman with my eyes and a defiant smile, holding a baby wrapped in a handmade blanket. My mother. Me. Another photo showed the same woman, older, standing in front of a small, weary-looking house. My grandmother, Maeve. Her smile was sad, but her eyes were fierce. There was a small, tarnished silver locket, empty inside. And at the bottom, there was a bus ticket. It was a one-way ticket to a town called Sparrow Creek. Tucked into the fold of the ticket was a single, crisp $50 bill. And a note written in the same familiar, spidery handwriting I remembered from a birthday card long ago. The note was short, just 5 words. "The answer is in the roots. The answer is in the roots." What did that mean? I looked from the note to the photograph of the house. It was small and simple, with a sagging porch and peeling white paint. Behind it, I could just make out the peak of another building's roof. A stable, maybe. An ancillary outbuilding. I held the bus ticket. It was a choice. Stay here, in the city, and let the property go, just as Mr. Davies advised. Let the ghost of my grandmother fade away into a file, a debt, a forgotten story. Or I could go. I could use this $50 and this ticket and go to Sparrow Creek. I could see the place for myself. I had 90 days, 83 now. It was a stupid choice, an irresponsible one. My logical mind, the one that had been trained for 12 years to survive, screamed at me to stay, to be practical. But the part of me that had held onto a smooth gray stone for a decade, the part that remembered the smell of lavender and soil, that part whispered something else. It whispered, go. I had $50, a box of ghosts, and a cryptic message. It wasn't a plan. It was barely a direction. But it was more than I'd had the day before. That night, I didn't go back to the shelter. I went to the bus station. The bus ride to Sparrow Creek was a journey backward in time. The sprawling cityscape slowly gave way to suburbs, then to stretches of highway flanked by identical-looking strip malls. Then, even those disappeared. The landscape softened into rolling hills, patches of dense forest, and wide open fields. The bus grew emptier with every stop. I was the only person who stayed on all the way to the end of the line. The driver, a man with a weathered face and kind eyes, glanced at me in the rearview mirror as he pulled into the deserted-looking town square. Sparrow Creek, he announced to the empty bus. End of the line. You sure this is where you wanted to go, miss? I nodded, gathering my trash bag of clothes and the small cardboard box. I'm sure, I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. He gave me a doubtful look. Not much here anymore. Used to be a nice little town. The mill closed 20 years back. Most folks left. He sighed, opening the door. The address you're looking for, the old O'Connell place. It's about a 2-mile walk. Head straight down this road, past the old church. Can't miss it. Last place on the left before the road turns to dirt. He helped me with my bag, a small act of kindness that felt monumental. You got people here? He asked gently. I shook my head. Just a house. He paused, then reached into his pocket. Look, the bus back to the city leaves at 6 a.m. tomorrow. If you change your mind. He pressed a folded bill into my hand. It was a 20. For the ticket back, he said before I could protest. Sometimes you just gotta see for yourself. But sometimes you gotta know when to leave, too. He tipped his hat and climbed back onto the bus, leaving me alone in the silent square. I stood there for a long moment, the weight of his kindness and his warning settling on me. The town was just as he'd described. A handful of buildings, most of them boarded up. A general store with a flickering neon sign, a post office, and a gas station with rusted-out pumps. It felt like a town holding its breath, waiting for something to happen or for everything to finally end. The air was different here. It was clean and sharp, smelling of pine and damp earth. It was the smell I remembered on my grandmother's hand. Following the driver's directions, I started walking. The road was cracked and lined with weeds. I passed a beautiful old church with boarded-up windows and a crumbling bell tower. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of my own footsteps and the rustle of the wind in the tall, overgrown grass. It took me almost an hour, my single bag growing heavier with every step. And then I saw it. Just as he'd said, the last house on the left. It was exactly like the photograph, only more so. More tired, more weathered, more forgotten. The paint was almost completely gone, leaving the wood bare and gray. The porch sagged so dramatically in the middle, it looked like it was sighing. The windows were dark and empty, like vacant eyes. Weeds had conquered the front yard, growing as high as my waist. But it was real. It was solid. It was mine, at least for the next 82 days. Behind the house stood the other building, the ancillary outbuilding. It was a small stable, its roofline sharp against the pale afternoon sky. The front door of the house was locked, the wood swollen tight in its frame. I walked around the side, peering through a grimy window into a small, dark kitchen. I could see a simple wooden table and 2 chairs, everything covered in a thick layer of dust. It was a ghost ship. I made my way to the back. The stable door wasn't locked. It hung slightly ajar, secured by a loop of rusted wire. I pulled the wire free, and the heavy door groaned open, the sound unnaturally loud in the profound silence. The inside of the stable was dark and cool. It smelled of old hay, dry earth, and something else, something metallic and faint. Light filtered in through the grimy panes of a single high window, illuminating millions of dancing dust motes. It wasn't a large space. There were 2 stalls on the left, their doors gone, the floors covered in remnants of old, rotted straw. On the right was a small, dusty workbench, a few rusted tools hanging on the wall above it. It was empty. Disappointingly, completely empty. For a moment, I felt a crushing wave of despair. I had come all this way for this. For an empty, derelict building and a house I couldn't even get into? The bus driver's words came back to me. Sometimes you gotta know when to leave. I sank down onto the packed earth floor, my back against the rough-hewn wall, and pulled out the note again. The answer is in the roots. I looked around the stable. Roots. There were no trees in here. Plant roots? No. I thought about the word. Roots. Foundations. Beginnings. The source of something. My gaze fell to the floor. It was mostly packed dirt, but in the center of the walkway between the stalls, there was a section of wide wooden planks, like a small, raised platform. They looked different from the rest of the structure, older, thicker. I ran my hand over them. They were solid, covered in a century of grime. It was nothing. It was just a floor. I was chasing ghosts, seeing patterns where there were none. I was about to give up, to go back to the town square and wait for the 6 a.m. bus, when my fingers brushed against something. A small, almost invisible indentation in the side of one of the planks. I leaned closer, brushing away the dirt. It wasn't an indentation. It was a hole, perfectly round, about the size of a finger. A finger pull. My heart started to beat a little faster. I hooked my finger into the hole and pulled. Nothing. It was wedged tight. I tried again, bracing my feet and pulling with all my strength. The plank groaned in protest, then shifted just a fraction of an inch. Hope, that dangerous, stupid thing, surged through me. I looked around the stable for something to use as a lever. On the workbench, among the rusted tools, was a long, heavy-duty crowbar. I grabbed it, the cold metal a shock to my hands. I wedged the flat end into the tiny gap I'd created and pushed down. The wood splintered and screamed, but it began to lift. I worked my way around the edge of the section of flooring, prying and lifting. It was a trapdoor. A heavy, thick, perfectly concealed trapdoor. After 10 minutes of sweat and strained muscles, I finally managed to heave it all the way open. It fell back with a loud thud, revealing a dark, square hole in the earth. A set of steep, wooden steps led down into blackness. My inheritance wasn't the land. It wasn't the house. It was this. A hole in the ground. The note had said the answer was in the roots. This was as close to roots as I was going to get. Taking a deep, shaky breath, I started down the stairs. The air grew colder with each step, and the earthy smell intensified. At the bottom, my feet touched a solid stone floor. It was a small, square room, a cellar dug out beneath the stable. It was completely bare, except for one thing. In the center of the room sat a large, heavy, metal footlocker. It wasn't rusted. It looked new, its dark green paint almost untouched. It was sealed with a heavy-duty padlock. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it. This had to be it. But the lock was thick and solid. I had no key. Defeated, I trudged back up the stairs into the dusty light of the stable. A key. Where would she have hidden a key? It wouldn't be obvious. I thought about my grandmother, or the version of her I had constructed from a handful of memories and a fierce-eyed photograph. She was careful. She was clever. She wouldn't leave it under a rock. I walked back into the stable, my eyes scanning every surface. The workbench, the empty stalls, the walls. Nothing. I looked at the trapdoor again, the heavy wooden planks I'd just pried up. I ran my hand along the underside, the wood rough and splintery. And there, screwed into the wood, was a small metal hook. Hanging from the hook was a single, small brass key. She had hidden it on the door itself. Of course she had. It was so simple, so brilliant. You couldn't find the key unless you'd already found the door. With the key clutched in my hand, I descended back into the cold, dark cellar. The key slid into the padlock with a satisfying click. I took a breath, turned it, and the lock sprang open. I lifted the heavy clasp and slowly, carefully, I raised the lid of the footlocker. I think a part of me expected gold bars, like in a movie, or jewels, something dramatic and life-changing. What I saw was, in its own way, far more shocking. The footlocker was filled, almost to the brim, with cash. Stacks and stacks of it, neatly bundled with rubber bands. 50s and hundreds. It wasn't a pirate's treasure. It was just money. Quiet, real, overwhelming money. I reached in and touched a stack. The paper felt crisp, real. I had no idea how much was there. Tens of thousands? Hundreds of thousands? It was more money than I had ever seen, more than I could comprehend. My first thought was that she'd robbed a bank. That my quiet, gentle grandmother was some kind of criminal mastermind. But underneath the first layer of cash, there was something else. A large, sealed manila envelope with my name, Elara, written on it in her familiar, spidery script. And beside it, a small, old-fashioned tape recorder, the kind with tiny cassette tapes. There were a dozen tapes, each one labeled with a number, 1 through 12. A cassette was already in the recorder. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely function. I set the envelope aside and picked up the recorder. There was a button on the side that said play. I pressed it. After a moment of static, a voice filled the small, cold cellar. A voice I hadn't heard in 12 years, but that I recognized instantly. It was low and steady, with the faint, lyrical cadence I remembered. It was my grandmother, Maeve. "Elara," she said, and I gasped, the sound of my own name in her voice a physical blow. "If you are listening to this, it means you found it. It means you were clever enough and stubborn enough to not listen to the lawyers and the sensible people. It means you are your mother's daughter. And mine. I'm proud of you, little bird. I am so, so proud." I sank to the stone floor, the tape recorder clutched in my hands, and I started to cry. Not quiet, dignified tears, but the wrenching, gut-deep sobs of a child who had just found something she thought was lost forever. I cried for the 12 years of silence. I cried for the woman I barely knew, but had missed every single day. I cried because for the first time since I was 6 years old, I wasn't entirely alone. Her voice, tinny and recorded, wrapped around me in the darkness. "There's a lot I need to tell you," she continued, her voice calm and measured. "A lot I couldn't tell you before." It's a long story, so I hope you're sitting comfortably. The money. We'll get to the money. But first, you need to understand where it came from. You need to understand what happened to your mother. And what happened to me. It all starts here, on this land. This isn't just dirt and a broken-down house, Elara. This is our story. This is home. I listened, huddled in the dark, as my grandmother's voice began to unravel the past, and every word changed the world I thought I knew. Her voice on the tape was both a comfort and a terror. It was the sound of home, but it was telling a story I wasn't prepared for. Your mother, Lena, she began. She was a firefly, bright and beautiful, and always darting toward the most dangerous lights. She fell in love with a man, not a good man. He was charming, handsome, the kind of man who can talk a bird out of a tree. He was also a part of a world I never wanted for her or for you. He was involved with people who didn't solve problems with words, they solved them with violence. I could hear the tightness in her voice, the carefully controlled grief. He got himself into a deep, deep hole. He borrowed money he couldn't repay from a man named Julian Croft. He's not a loan shark, Ilara, he's worse. He's a developer, a businessman. He buys people, not just property. When your father couldn't pay, Croft offered him a deal. He would work for him, off the books. His driver, his enforcer. Your father took the deal. He thought it was a way out. It was just a different kind of cage. A car. Your father was driving, Croft was in the back. There was an accident. It wasn't an accident. The police called it a single-vehicle collision, but it wasn't. It was an ambush. Another car ran them off the road. Your father, he didn't survive. But Croft did. And in the trunk of the car was a briefcase. A briefcase that didn't belong to Croft. It belonged to the people who ran him off the road. And in the chaos, your father, I think in a last, desperate attempt to give you and your mother something, a way out, he had hidden it. When the first responders arrived, the briefcase was gone. My own father, a man I'd never known, who I'd been told had simply left. He hadn't left. He'd died trying to escape a trap. The story I'd been told my whole life was a lie. A comfortable, simple lie to cover a raw, complicated truth. Croft was convinced your mother knew where the briefcase was, Maeve's voice continued, laced with a cold fury. He believed your father had told her about it before he died. He started threatening her, calling at all hours, cars parked outside our house. He wanted his insurance policy back, he called it. Your mother was terrified. Not for herself. For you. You were just a baby. She came to me, right here in this house, and she told me everything. She had a plan. A desperate, terrible plan. The tape clicked off. The end of the first cassette. The silence in the cellar was deafening. My hands were numb. I fumbled with the recorder, ejecting the first tape and inserting the second. My movements were clumsy, mechanical. I pressed play. Lena's plan, Maeve's voice resumed, was to disappear. She knew Croft would never stop looking for her as long as he thought she had what he wanted. So she had to make him believe she was gone. And she had to make sure he would never, ever look for you. So she did the hardest thing a mother can do. She gave you up. I choked back a sob. It wasn't abandonment, it was protection. She made it look like she ran, left a note, packed a bag. Made it look like she couldn't handle being a single mother. She knew the state would take you. She knew you'd be safe in the system, anonymous, a needle in a haystack where a man like Croft would never think to look. And me, my job was to stay here, to be the grieving mother, the abandoned grandmother, to be the rock that Croft would smash himself against. He came here, many times. He and his men, they tore this house apart looking for that briefcase. They never found it, because it was never here. Your father, bless his panicked soul, had thrown it into a river miles from here. It was long gone. But Croft would never believe that. I could hear her take a shaky breath on the tape. For years, he watched me. He had people in town report on me, every move I made. I couldn't contact you, Ilara. It would have put you in danger. It would have led him right to you. It was the price we had to pay for your safety. It broke my heart every single day. Your mother, she moved to the other side of the country. A new name, a new life. We spoke once a year, on your birthday, from a payphone. She'd ask how you were. I couldn't tell her because I wasn't allowed to know. That was part of the deal. No contact. So I just tell her I was sure you were fine. I'm sure you were thriving. We lied to each other once a year to keep from falling apart. This was too much. It was a flood, washing away the foundations of everything I knew. My mother wasn't a monster who had abandoned me. She was a hero who had sacrificed everything. My grandmother wasn't a distant memory who had forgotten me. She was a guardian, a silent sentinel who had stood between me and a monster for my entire life. Now, the money, her voice said, pulling me back from the edge. This is the hard part. This is the part I'm not proud of. After a few years, Croft's attention started to wane. He had bigger problems. But I knew he'd never forget. And I knew that one day you would be 18. You would leave the system. And you would be alone and vulnerable. You needed a shield. You needed a future. So I started to prepare. That man, Julian Croft, he built his empire on secrets. And people who live in glass houses, they tend to leave the stones lying all around them. I started watching him, listening. For years, I was just the crazy old lady in the broken-down house. No one paid me any mind. And people talk when they think no one is listening. I learned about his deals, his shell corporations, his partners, the ones he was cheating. I could hear a grim satisfaction in her voice now. I got a job cleaning offices in the city, a different city, an hour away. One of the offices belonged to a very small, very discreet accounting firm. And one night, I saw a name I recognized on a file left on a desk. It was one of Croft's shell companies. And I did something I never thought I was capable of. I started to steal from him. My jaw dropped. It wasn't much at first, she explained. A little here, a little there. Skimming from unaudited accounts, redirecting payments. He was moving so much dirty money, he never noticed. It was a drop in his ocean. But my bucket started to fill. For 10 years, Alara, I took his money. Every penny in this box, I stole it from the man who destroyed our family. It's not clean money, it's poison. But I hoped that maybe, in your hands, it could be an antidote. It's enough to pay the taxes. It's enough to fix this house. It's enough for you to build a life, a real life, right here. Or it's enough for you to disappear and start over somewhere new, just like your mother did. The tape went quiet for a moment. I could hear the faint sound of her breathing. There's a letter in the envelope. It has more details. Contact information for your mother. She's waiting for you, Alara. She has been waiting for 12 years. But there's a choice you have to make. And this is the most important part. Her voice became low, urgent. Croft is still out there. He's older now, but he's no less dangerous. His development company, Blackwood, has been trying to buy this land for years. Not because it's valuable, but because he's a man who can't stand to lose. He's obsessed. He still believes there's something here. The back taxes, the pressure. That's him. He's been waiting for me to die so he can finally get his hands on this property and tear it to the ground. He thinks he's won. So here is your choice, little bird. You can take this money and run. Disappear. Find your mother and never look back. No one would blame you. Or you can stay. You can pay the taxes. You can claim this land. You can put the deed in your name, and in doing so, you will be planting a flag right in his face. You will be telling him that the O'Connell women are not gone, that we are still here. It is the most dangerous thing you could possibly do. It will bring his eyes right back here, right back to you. But it is also the only way to stop running, the only way to truly come home. The tape ended, not with a click, but with the soft hiss of empty ribbon. The choice she laid out was impossible. Run and be safe, but always be looking over my shoulder. Or stay and fight and risk everything for a home I'd never known. I sat there in the dark, the cold of the stone floor seeping into my bones for what felt like hours. My entire life had been a lie, but it was a lie designed to keep me safe. Now I had the truth, and the truth was a weapon pointed straight at my heart. I thought about the shelter, the gray anonymity of my life. I thought about the bus driver's pitying look. I thought about Mr. Davies, the lawyer, telling me to let the ghost go. They were all wrong. This wasn't a ghost. It was a legacy. It was a story of sacrifice and fierce, unending love. How could I turn my back on that? How could I let a man like Julian Croft win? After everything my mother and grandmother had endured, how could I choose to be afraid? My decision wasn't a lightning bolt. It was a slow, quiet dawn. I would stay. I would fight. I would take this poisoned money and turn it into a foundation. I would take this broken-down house and make it a home. I wasn't just Ilara Vance, ward of the state anymore. I was Ilara O'Connell Vance, and I was home. The first thing I did was climb out of the cellar and close the heavy trapdoor, putting the key back in its hiding place. The money could stay there for now. It was safe. Then I walked back to the house. I found a broken pane in a back window, carefully cleared the glass, and climbed inside. The air was thick with the smell of dust and disuse, but underneath it, I could smell the house itself, old wood, plaster, and the faint, lingering scent of my grandmother's lavender. I walked through the small rooms, my hand trailing along the furniture, leaving paths in the thick dust. This was her home. This was my home. I wasn't afraid anymore. I was angry, and I was determined. That night, I didn't sleep in the house. It felt too much like trespassing on a memory. I slept in the stable, wrapped in the thin blanket from the shelter, my head on my bag of clothes. I felt safer there, closer to the source of the truth. The next morning, I woke with the sun. I took $1,000 from the footlocker, a fraction of what was there, and tucked it into my pocket. I walked the 2 miles back to the town square. The general store was open. An old woman with kind, curious eyes watched me as I bought a bottle of water and a protein bar. "You're new," she said. It wasn't a question. "I'm staying at the O'Connell place," I said. Her eyes widened slightly. "Maeve's place?" I thought that was being sold. "No," I said, my voice clearer and stronger than I thought possible. "I'm her granddaughter. I'm keeping it." A slow smile spread across her face. "Well, I'll be," she said. "It's about time someone stood up to that Blackwood company. Maeve was a tough old bird. Looks like you are, too. She told me her name was Carol. She told me the next bus to the county seat, where the tax office was, would be through in an hour. The trip to the county office was surreal. I walked into the building, a place designed to intimidate, and I felt nothing but a cold, clear purpose. I stood in line, the cash in my pocket a secret weapon. When my turn came, I handed the clerk the tax notice. He looked at it, then at me. "That's a big number for a kid," he said, not unkindly. "You want to set up a payment plan?" "No," I said. "I'm here to pay it. In full." I pulled out the wad of cash and laid it on the counter. The clerk's eyes went wide. He counted it twice. He stamped the notice with a large, satisfying red stamp. Paid in full. He handed me a receipt. It was the most beautiful piece of paper I had ever seen. "The deed is in your grandmother's name," he said. "You'll need to go to the records office to have it transferred. You'll need a death certificate and proof you're the heir." I had the letter from the lawyer. I knew I could get the rest. For the first time, I had a task list, a purpose. When I got back to Sparrow Creek, there was a car parked in front of my house. A sleek, black sedan that was so out of place it looked like a spaceship. A man in a suit stood on the road, staring at the house. He was older, with perfectly coiffed silver hair and a face that was handsome but cold, like a marble statue. He turned as I approached, his eyes scanning me from head to toe. There was no doubt in my mind who this was. Julian Croft. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice steady. I clutched the tax receipt in my pocket like a talisman. He gave me a thin, humorless smile. "I don't think so," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "I was just admiring the property. I'm with Blackwood Development. We're acquiring land in the area. We were under the impression this parcel would soon be available." "You were mistaken," I said. "The taxes are paid." His smile didn't waver, but his eyes hardened. A flicker of something, annoyance, surprise, crossed his face. "Is that so? Well, the offer still stands. The place is a wreck. We'd be willing to take it off your hands, give you a generous price. Enough for a young lady like you to get a nice, fresh start somewhere else." It was a threat wrapped in a business proposal. "Go away, little girl." I thought of my grandmother's voice on the tape. "You will be planting a flag right in his face." I looked him straight in the eye. "It's not for sale," I said. "This is my home." He stared at me for a long moment, his mask of civility cracking just enough for me to see the predator underneath. He was reassessing me. I wasn't just some stray kid. I was an obstacle. "A pity," he said softly. He got back in his car, the door closing with a heavy, final thud. As he drove away, I knew my grandmother was right. This was just the beginning. I had won the first battle, but the war had just started. But as I stood there, on my own land, with the paid-in-full receipt in my pocket and the truth finally settled in my heart, I wasn't scared. I was ready. The days that followed were a blur of hard, satisfying work. I used the money from the vault, my war chest, as I'd started to call it, to buy supplies, cleaning products, tools, paint, lumber. Carol, from the general store, connected me with a retired handyman named George who seemed to know everything about everything. He showed me how to patch the roof, how to replace the broken window panes, how to coax the ancient plumbing back to life. He never asked where I got the money. He just seemed to accept that Maeve's granddaughter was as stubborn and resourceful as she had been. People in town started to talk. At first, they just watched me with curiosity. Then, a few started to stop by. One woman brought me a pot of stew. Another dropped off a box of old gardening tools. They were small gestures, but they felt enormous. They were the roots my grandmother had talked about, spreading out, taking hold. One afternoon, while I was sanding the old porch railings, a package arrived. It was from Mr. Davies, the lawyer. Inside was the official updated deed to the property, now legally in my name. And there was a letter. It was different from his first one. The tone was less formal, almost impressed. "Miss Vance," it began, "I was surprised, to say the least, to be informed by the county that the back taxes on your grandmother's property had been paid in full. I was even more surprised to receive a call from an attorney representing Blackwood Development, inquiring as to whether the property was now on the market. When I informed him it was not, he was quite displeased. He went on to say that my grandmother had, in her will, set aside a small retainer for his services should I choose to fight for the property. It wasn't much, but it meant I had a lawyer. "It seems I underestimated your grandmother," he wrote, "and perhaps I underestimated you as well. Should Mr. Croft or his associates cause you any trouble, do not hesitate to call me." It would be a professional pleasure to assist you. I had an ally, a real, powerful ally. The biggest step, the one I had been putting off, was the envelope from the footlocker. The one with my mother's contact information. I was terrified. What would I say? What if she didn't want to see me? What if the reality of her didn't live up to the hero my grandmother had described? One night, after a long day of painting, I sat in the now clean kitchen, the single bare bulb overhead casting a warm glow, and I opened it. Inside was a letter from Maeve, explaining everything again, more gently this time. And there was a phone number. A phone number for a woman named Lena Peterson, living in a small town in Oregon. My mother. It took me an hour to get up the nerve to dial. I used the new landline I'd had installed, a defiant act of permanence. It rang 3 times. Then a woman's voice answered. Hello? It was a voice I didn't know, and yet there was something in its cadence. A faint echo of the firefly my grandmother had described. Is this Lena? I asked, my own voice trembling. There was a pause. Who is this? It's Elara. Silence. For a moment I thought she had hung up. Then I heard a sound, a sharp intake of breath, a muffled sob. Elara? Oh my God, is it really you? We talked for 3 hours. We cried. She told me about her life, the quiet, lonely life she had built. She was a librarian. She had never remarried. She had never had any other children. She had spent 12 years waiting for this phone call. She asked me a million questions. Was I okay? Where was I? When I told her I was at the house, that I had paid the taxes, that I was staying, she went silent again. Oh, honey, she whispered. You're so brave, braver than me. No, I told her, the words coming easily, truthfully. You were the brave one. You and Grandma. You saved me. Now it's my turn to save this place, for us. Before we hung up, she said, I'm coming home, Elara. I'm getting on the next plane. I'm coming home. This story, the one I'm telling you now, it's not over. My mother is coming. Mr. Croft is still out there, watching and waiting. The house still needs a lot of work, but something fundamental has shifted. I am no longer a girl defined by what she has lost. I am a woman defined by what she has found. This inheritance wasn't the money in the vault. It was the truth. It was the story of 2 women who loved me enough to let me go, and who trusted me enough to find my way back. It was the gift of a choice, to run or to stand my ground, and I chose to stand. The house is slowly coming back to life. I've started planting a garden in the front yard, turning over the soil my grandmother's hands once tended. The roots. I finally understand. The roots aren't just in the ground. They're in the stories we tell, the sacrifices we honor, the homes we build not with wood and nails, but with love and resilience and the courage to fight for what's yours. This land, this house, it's not just property, it's a promise I intend to keep. If you've made it this far, thank you. Thank you for listening. So many of us are handed stories about our lives that are incomplete or just plain wrong. We're told we were abandoned when we were being protected. We're told something is worthless when it holds the key to everything. Have you ever had a moment like that? A moment where you discovered the truth was bigger and more complicated than you ever imagined. I want you to share it in the comments below. Not for me, but for everyone else here. Because this isn't just a channel. It's a community of people who know what it's like to have to dig for the truth, to fight for your own story. Your story matters. So please, subscribe and join us. Because we all have a vault to open. And sometimes, the most valuable thing inside is the truth.